My name is Elena Cross, and the first thing you should know is that silence is not peace, because silence has teeth that bite harder than any scream, and for years I let that silence gnaw away at me until there was nothing left but the echo of my brother's death and the promise I made to myself that one day the world would hear what had been buried beneath the weight of corporate lies. The city I live in is not just glass towers and neon lights, because behind every polished lobby and every smiling receptionist there is a hidden ledger, a falsified report, and a bloodstain scrubbed clean before anyone could notice. And I learned that truth the night my brother Daniel staggered into my apartment with fear carved across his face, holding a flash drive like it was the last piece of his soul, telling me that he had uncovered something that could bring down the most powerful man in the city, a CEO whose name was spoken like a law, whose empire sat on greed and intimidation, whose shadow stretched into every courtroom, every police station, and every politician's office. He told me that if anything happened to him I should never stop asking questions, never stop looking, and then he left before I could convince him to stay. And by morning the news reported his car had veered off the bridge into the river, an accident they said, but I knew better, because accidents come with brake lines cut clean through and witnesses who suddenly forget what they saw. For weeks I wandered the city like a ghost, retracing Daniel's steps, replaying his final words, and I could feel the city mocking me with its lights and its noise, as if daring me to prove what I already knew, that the powerful can murder in plain sight and wrap the crime in paperwork so neat that no one dares to question it. I went to the police, but they treated me like a grieving sister spinning conspiracies. I went to lawyers who shook their heads because cases against men like Victor Hale, the CEO Daniel had named, always died in court before they began. And so the silence grew sharper until I understood that if I wanted justice I would have to become something colder than grief and more patient than rage. I took Daniel's flash drive and I taught myself to read the language of corruption, numbers hidden inside contracts, shell companies folded inside one another like Russian dolls, and I built a map that stretched across the city like veins feeding a rotten heart. By day I worked as an archivist in a municipal records office, a job no one paid attention to, where I filed documents and processed data, invisible in a gray cubicle, and by night I transformed into something else, slipping into places where I didn't belong, listening to conversations through vents, copying files left carelessly on desks, tracing payments that flowed like blood into the pockets of politicians. I watched Victor Hale from a distance, his limousine sliding through the streets like a shark, his smile on television interviews polished to perfection, and I felt the hatred coil tighter inside me until it became a second spine. It would have been easy to lash out, to scream his guilt to the world, but noise without proof is just air, and I needed silence to become my weapon. So I waited. I built a dossier thicker than a Bible, photographs, recordings, signatures, and every night I whispered to Daniel that I was getting closer, that his death would not be written off as a paragraph in a corporate report. But revenge is not just patience, it is risk, and I walked a razor's edge because men like Victor do not stay blind for long. As I began to notice shadows trailing me, men with blank faces sitting in cars too long on my street, coworkers asking questions that felt rehearsed. And once I came home to find my apartment door slightly ajar, though nothing was taken, a warning written in silence telling me they knew I was moving against them. That was when I decided to change the rules, because silence had kept me alive, but silence alone would not finish this. I reached out to people who had lost everything, to Victor Hale families ruined by layoffs while executives received bonuses, whistleblowers silenced with lawsuits until they drowned in debt, and slowly I built a circle of the broken, all carrying pieces of a puzzle that none of them realized fit together. They trusted me because I carried Daniel's name and his evidence, and together we planned not just to expose Victor, but to make him watch as the empire he built collapsed from the inside. The night it happened was not lightning and fire but precision and shadows. I walked into a gala where Victor was toasting his success, a diamond smile beneath chandeliers, and I was dressed not as a guest but as a ghost in borrowed clothes, slipping through service corridors until I reached the control room. The dossier was no longer just files on my desk, it had been transformed into a digital storm waiting to be unleashed, and when I pressed the key, screens across the hall began to flicker, the live feed hijacked, and the crowd of elites watched in silence as their king's sins were displayed before them, contract after contract, image after image, accounts traced to offshore vaults, names of those he had silenced including Daniel's. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream I had ever heard, because it was the silence of belief shattering. Victor's face did not break immediately because men like him believe in their own invincibility, but when the room turned from admiration to horror, when whispers began to ripple like fire, he finally understood that his empire was bleeding, and I stood in the shadows watching him drown in the truth he had buried. That should have been the end, the moment where justice and revenge aligned, but revenge is never clean. Police arrived not to arrest him but to shield him. Investors scrambled to cut ties, and in the chaos I slipped away nameless and unseen, because my war was never about applause, it was about Daniel, about the promise I whispered into the silence of his grave. Even now I wonder if I became what I despised, if in tearing down a monster I carved myself into one, because I learned to manipulate, to deceive, to hurt without mercy. And when I look at my reflection I see not the archivist I once was, but a woman forged from silence and sharpened by grief. Some nights I dream that Daniel is still alive, that he comes home with the flash drive and a nervous smile, and I wake with tears that burn like acid because reality is colder. But then I remember the look on Victor's face when the walls closed in, and I tell myself it was worth it. If you are listening to this confession, then know that silence is not empty, it is a blade, and I carried it until it cut through the lies of a man who believed himself untouchable. I am Elena Cross, and I am the keeper of silence, and silence always remembers.